Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday. Today what we're going to be talking about is how to build a home or office hacking lab on a budget. So starting from free all the way up to six-figure. Where we're going to start is with on-host, then we'll talk about single server and multiple server setups. So starting with the most economical option, the free to $200 option. What you have really is an on-host. So if you're doing security research, whether offensive or defensive, for pen testing, threat hunting, anything, what the on-host gets you is it uses the power of the machine you already have, a laptop, maybe an old tower lying around. And where the options span that free to $200 range is you have things like VirtualBox and Hyper-V and VMware Workstation that have free versions. These are able to run the virtual machines you need to, create the virtual networks, build that environment you need to. Where you get to the top of this $200 price when you look at options is when you get into the Workstation Pro Hypervisor. So, getting into what the difference is, let's talk about the pros and cons, and you'll see what really you get on the higher end versus the lower end. So the pros of this is it's OS independent. These run on Mac, they run on Linux, they run on Windows. So you're not tied to having to have a Windows machine or having to have a Mac machine. The software you use will be specific. So if you're on the Mac side, you might need something like Parallels, or you might need VMware Fusion if you're going to the paid version of this. But again, you have OS independent options if you're going with the on-host version. This is cost efficient and space efficient. So unlike when you do actually get into having to run one or more servers, this is something you can have at your house and not have to worry about power or heating or ventilation or air conditioning, any of those options. On the flip side, some of these tools have limited features. So when you get into the free version of Workstation versus Workstation Pro, for example, the Pro version has some of the more advanced networking feature, VM management features, and really nice to haves, but if you're just starting out, you might not need that paid version. So you can actually get a lot for even staying on the free end of this. So as you outgrow the on-host tier of this, and you might outgrow it because you quite honestly run out of resources, you might need more CPU cores, you might need more memory than what just your laptop can provide. The second tier gets you to the single server tier, or single host tier, dedicated host in this case. And in this tier, typically what I've seen on projects that I've done in places where I've set up similar labs, you'll see $200 to $3,500 range. Again, if you have the hardware, you're buying kind of a cheaper PC or old box, you might be in the 200 range. Right here, this is actually a Hades Canyon NUC. It's one of the Intel NUCs. This is actually an ESX server, and this is what we use a lot when we're doing research and when we're moving up here. So this is an example of a $3,500 option. A lot of times what we'll do, and we use other manufacturers for these too, but this one's outfitted with like 64 gigs of RAM. This one has an i7. The newer ones have Intel i9 processors. But you can even do things like in this NUC, in the Intel NUCs and some of the others, you can put actually up to 20 terabytes. So these have M2 solid state drives, the little like gumstick looking drives. They're making them in 4 and 8 terabytes now. Some of the slots in here, or some of these types of machines have 2 to 3 slots. And so again, you'll quickly scale beyond both in the memory and the disk and other resources you might run out here as you get up here. Now the hypervisor that you run, this is also to where on host, you're running the hypervisor product in Windows. On single server, this is where it actually the hypervisor begins to become the operating system of the host. So when you talk about options and what you actually put on here, this one has ESXi. It's actually a free version of kind of an upgrade of Workstation. It's a server that runs just straight on there. vSphere is actually an upgrade from that. So when you actually start getting into the paid option of this, just for $577 is what VMware is charging it for today. What you get with that is the ability to run on 3 servers. So you can run on up to 3 of these with 2 CPU cores each. This is kind of the entry level when you start getting into the paid version of that. And again, the difference we'll talk about when we get into it, but it begins to come into the management and how many resources you're putting behind this. Other options you have on this are still open source solutions, so like Zen, Hypervisor, Hyper-V, some of the other ones, or you can even do this in the cloud. And so AWS and Azure, if you don't want to even have a small footprint box or a regular server, you can push it up into the cloud. Now the pros here, the pros of going to the single server route versus the on-host is you get more scalability. So even with my laptop my laptop has an i9, this has an i7, I get better performance on some of my VMs on this just because, again, it's a very, the hypervisor is installed at a lower level. This isn't trying to run all the other software that my endpoint's running. And so you're going to have better performance. You're going to have better scalability. Some of the features in here too are just a little more optimized than when you're running it on your host. Creative networking. So what's nice with these and why I really like these NUCs is you have 2 Ethernet ports in them. And so often what we'll do is we'll have one of these ports be the uplink going out to the internet, and we'll set up a virtual, one of the virtual port groups to VMs that need to touch the internet, they can touch the internet. Now, the other one will often have VMs that we run into another switch, into a private switch where we don't want those VMs to touch the internet. Oftentimes that's what we'll do with the other switch. So for example, specific to security, if you're testing malware, if you're doing things that shouldn't touch the internet from the VM, what's nice with this is, again, you get into a point to where you have 2 NICs that can be dedicated to different purposes on there. You can do that on the on-host option if you're using network dongles, but then sometimes you get into kind of spaghetti of dongles as you're setting up your machine. So with the single server, like I said, with some of the NUCs, you can get 2 to 3, and NUCs are next unit of computing, it's the portable ones. You can get 2 to 3 or even more Ethernet ports in there. I should also say at this tier, scalability, we scaled down small to this, and what's nice with this is it doesn't take up much space in my office, it doesn't take up power. The other way you can scale this single server is, again, onto a traditional server. So buy a server from Dell, from HP, whoever you buy servers through. And again, in that scalability, you'll actually scale to some of the better processors than the i7, i9 consumer processors. You'll get into some of the Xeon processors and higher end Intel ones. Again, you'll have to watch which version of vSphere you have because that does actually raise your price and might kick you into the next bucket as you go there. The con of this, you need dedicated hardware to where it's efficiently running on there. You're eventually going to outgrow, and so we've outgrown some, so sometimes our solution to outgrowing is adding an extra 1 or 2 of these, because again, if you get the license, you can run it on 3 of those. And with the cloud costs, you have to watch your cloud costs creep. And so you don't have to run these on site. You can run them in AWS or Azure, but you need to make sure that you're watching your bill and not getting too ridiculous with what you're using. So finally, what you're going to do with the single server, if you're at this tier, you're going to hit a point to where you're going to cap out on what you can do on the single server tier. And so on host, you might be able to run a dozen, maybe even 24 VMs here, depending on how many resources you're allocating to each VM and how beefy your laptop or home computer is that you're running it on. With single server, again, on the box that I showed you, we're able to run 2, 3, up to 4 dozen VMs. I've even seen VMs in 60, 70 VM range if you're running them small, even from that small footprint that I showed you earlier on the single server. At some point though, the complexity of the network or the resources there, you're going to hit another bottleneck. And so when you're growing the lab beyond that, what we often do then is scale the single server option out to the multiple server. And so again, this is where it's $3,500 up. I built ranges that have been all the way up to 6 figures and even higher based on how much we're scaling and how much we're connecting in. The products that you use actually can be very similar, right? So if you're in the cloud, you're still using AWS or Azure. But if you're not, if you're hosting it on-prem, you're still using things like vSphere. And especially this is where some of the higher ends of vSphere can help you out. Because when you get into the pros of it, you have even better performance. When you're building out these multiple server setups to scale up to hundreds or even thousands or more VMs, what you have now is a cluster of computing nodes that are actually running the VMs. You have a cluster of storage nodes that are storing, the VMs that are running, bringing files in. And what you're doing is you're basically building that cluster up to the scale that you needed to be at. With that too, what's nice is a lot of the software when you're at this tier has fault tolerance, right? So if you have a host die, in the single server case, if your host dies, your range is host. In multiple server, what's nice is a lot of the applications will move VMs around, they'll be efficient, they'll really take advantage of the processing power that's out on your network. So really when you get up here, this is what gives you that efficiency to really scale the range out and be able to do more. Your overhead though on the con side also scales, right? You have to have people manage this. And if your organization or if you're doing this for a company, you have to watch what's the IT support going to be, who's going to run the server, who's going to run updates, what are the compliance and security requirements? Am I going to have to add things like two-factor auth, track who's coming in? If you have security issues with products to where you need to keep people isolated from certain parts of a virtual network, all of that complexity is going to add to your overhead. And obviously where here you're running a single host in the first two tiers, you're going to have more you have to manage there. The other negative side is HVAC, right? So on the single server that I showed you with that NUC, that's something I can pretty easily run in my office here and it's not going to be annoying. When you're getting into multiple servers, unless you have a server cabinet at your house, you might get annoyed with just the noise of this alone if you're not running it in a dedicated space. Let's talk about the other side. This was the hardware side of it. So quick note on operating systems and software to run this, right? If you're standing up a lab, if you're just starting with Linux VMs, so things like Kali, things like Ubuntu, you might have Windows licenses that you have before. Those will kind of get you started. But as you need more versions of Windows, there's a few options you can do. This focused a lot on hardware. For software, what you can do is definitely look at programs you might be eligible for. So discount programs if you're a student, right? When I was in school, we could go to our campus bookstore. We could get discounted versions of Windows. There were limits, but we could get, up to a certain number of Windows licenses. And again, you have to factor that in. But for students, there's options. For startups, there's options. What we use is what's called Visual Studio Pro. So it was the Microsoft Developer Network. And what you can do with that is for a subscription, you can get basically lab grade licenses of different Microsoft products, and they have tiers. So we have the Essentials tier, which I think is the lowest tier. It gets you access to most versions of Windows and a lot of versions of Microsoft software. So for us, we do a lot of testing with Microsoft software, among other things. But it's important to note that you have to be mindful of what those tiers are. I think we pay about $800 a year for that license to get copies of, a lot of copies of Microsoft for testing. We have run on projects where we needed the enterprise version. So Microsoft doesn't give every product at that low tier. There's at least three tiers that I know of, and each have different tools. So if you need a specific version of Exchange or you need a specific version of something else for testing, Microsoft actually has an Excel spreadsheet out there that you can check to say, okay, this is what I need for that. That being said, that license can be available for cheaper depending on professional organizations you're part of. So for a while, if you're an engineering student or you're eligible for IEEE or for ACM, for the Association of Computing Machinery, you can actually sign up and get a discount through your IEEE or ACM membership to get those ISOs. So definitely check with employers, check with your education side. But when this covers the server side, and to cover the OS side, there's a lot of options out there. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you'll join us next week, and we'll see you then.